Thank you, comrades. It's a great pleasure to be here, even if, as you all know, the topic is not an easy one. Like many of you, I've been involved in talking about Palestine for many years, including in this country. And there's always a hope that you can come, and you hope that you can come to an audience and say 2018 was different. Every year is a disappointment. Every year on the ground in Palestine is a year in which things became worse for the Palestinians. And there is another kind of common theme that probably you are familiar with as much as I am, is that the grave situation on the ground is not matched by actually the success in galvanizing solidarity and support for Palestine outside the country. In fact, 2018 was the most impressive year in the way we succeeded in galvanizing, recruiting solidarity and support for the boycott and divestment and sanction movement, for alerting for the first time politicians in corridors of power to take at least partial courageous positions on Palestine, which they have never done before. The EU has moved with some of its legislation in a way that was unthinkable before, not to mention the situation in campuses around the world and the willingness of people who beforehand were not courageous enough to say to Israel, I'm either not coming to you to visit you, or I don't want to receive your prices, or I don't want to have any formal or official connection with you. And this is an ongoing process. But because, in a way, of the success outside of Palestine, the fact that the situation on the ground is worse than it was the years before, the gap becomes wider. And with it, we all have to ask some important, incisive questions of why are we at this juncture, after struggling for 70 years, if not for 100 years, for the just cause of Palestine and the Palestinians. If you think about it, the Muslim world supports Palestine, the left supports Palestine, progressive Jews support Palestine, and yet nothing of it is translated on the ground, and nothing of it has stopped any of the criminal policies Israel is pursuing against the Palestinians wherever they are. So what I would like to do today is to look at the Trump era more as a kind of a signpost rather than giving too much credit to the president himself, but just seeing him as epitomizing a certain global, regional, and local realities which I hope we can then discuss between ourselves whether I'm right in my hopeless optimism. Every year I finish with an optimist sentence, all my talks, and I have these very supportive but quite compassionate looks by the audience who said, well, he must have drank something, or it's the heat, or God knows, or maybe he's short so he only sees the full half of the bottle and not the whole of it. But of course, activists cannot allow themselves not to be optimists, but there are some good reasons, looking at the Trump era, to hope, not to believe, but to hope, that this may help us to narrow somewhat, not dramatically, but to narrow somewhat the gap between our success as activists in bringing the issue of Palestine to every corner of the world, on the one hand, and our total failure with the Palestinians on the ground to change the dismal reality there. So I hope there's some signs which I would point to that I think bring us some hope. But again, this is something that has to be worked out, and we will have to meet in a year's time to see whether this optimism is vindicated. The first thing is the Trump administration itself. He seems to be, for all his sins, quite an honest person. He says what he thinks. He says what he thinks about African Americans. He says what he thinks about women. He says what he thinks about immigrants. And he says what he thinks about America's relations to Israel and Palestine. He's much more honest than his predecessor, who told us that he's committed to peace and reconciliation and justice in Palestine. We all listened to him in his famous Cairo address. I'm talking about Barack Obama. But then we noticed that the first speech he made when he was elected was to AIPAC in Washington. And he was no better than any previous president. And all the previous administrations were, as the Americans say, talking the talk of peace, of reconciliation and justice, but not walking the walk of peace, reconciliation and justice. In essence, all the American administrations were unashamedly and unconditionally pro-Israelis, and saw the role as mediators as fulfilling the role of a dishonest broker whose function is to try and exert pressure on the Palestinians to accept the Israeli dictate. This was the essence of all the peace efforts since 1967. It was unfortunately also the essence of the Oslo Accord. So here we have a president who says, yes, I'm openly pro-Israeli. That's what American presidents do. I'm not playing the game of a broker. We were never dishonest brokers. Why should we start being honest brokers with myself? One hopes, and this is where my first hope emerges, one hopes that this would be a wake-up call, first of all, to the Palestinians who still believe that America has a positive role to play in the fate of Palestine. So one really hopes that Palestinian leaders and activists who still believe in American involvement, and that the key, and we heard it here in these meetings for years as well, that the key is in Washington, that the key is not in Washington, the light is in Washington, but the key isn't there. I hope you all know this famous Jewish maxim. You don't look for the key where there is light. You look for the key where you have lost it. Washington might have the light, but the key is not there. The key is not in Washington. And I think Trump will help to convey the message that the United States is not playing anymore a decisive role in the history of Israel and Palestine. In fact, I think we will soon learn that the United States is not going to play a decisive role in the history of the Middle East and the Arab world. And in both cases, if we judge historically the impact that the United States had either on the Middle East as a whole or in Palestine in particular, we can only see a negative impact. We can hardly point to anything positive that came from an intensive American involvement in your country's or in your society's affair. So there is going to be a vacuum. And a vacuum, as Karl Marx always said, is always filled in history. Nobody leaves vacuums empty. And you have to be very careful not to lose your ability to be there instead of the forces that used to be there. And I don't know who will take over as an international actor. My great hope is, and that's why we should have these meetings year after year, is that the civil society, and not the political elites, would have a say not only in their own country's fate, but also in the fate of places like Palestine. Because let's face it, if we look at the civil society in this country, and we will translate it in what should be the British policy towards Palestine, we will get a very different understanding of what Britain could and should do in order to end the Israeli colonization, oppression, and occupation. But that doesn't happen. So the first thing is, in a way, transparency. A Trump transparency that would wake up anybody who still thought and was a genuine friend of us, or was part of the Palestinian people who really thought that Washington is the key for a solution. I once checked it, and Palestinians who were involved in the so-called peace negotiations, ever since 1993, spent half of the year in Washington. And the result can be seen on the ground. The second reason for guarded optimism in the Trump era is the overall death, to my mind, of the two-state solution. A lot of people were still sticking to it. A lot of political elites are still adhering to it. For Palestinians in the West Bank, for some of them, it still looks as the only way of ending the Israeli military occupation. For others in the world, it looks like a logical, reasonable situation. For my friend Norman Finkelstein, it looks like a legal issue that should be supported. But should be fair with ourselves. It's a dead body. It's been in the morgue for a few years now. And yes, every now and then someone comes out, takes the body out of the morgue, dons it with nice clothing and says it's still alive until it collapses because there's no life in it. As I said a few years ago, we should be invited to the funeral of this solution. And we have a proper mourning era for that. Because without proper burying of the two-state solution, it will be difficult to create, both in Palestine and outside of Palestine, a clear popular movement for the alternative. And the only alternative is one democratic state all over Palestine. And I think one of the immediate implications I've already noticed on the ground in Palestine for this clearer notion of the demise of the two-state solution is the fact that the attempts to create a popular movement for one democratic state all over Palestine have been upgraded. Until recently, there were quite a few academic conferences on the one-state solution. There were quite a few individuals who wrote exciting books about the one-state solution as a vision. But it was, as the French call it, it was a discourse. It was a discourse of one state. Namely, there was a lot of talk, there was a lot of conversation, but there was very little action in preparing a proper political movement to push forward the idea of a one-state solution. For the first time on the ground in Palestine, we have an initiative that tries to create a popular movement for the one-state solution, talking first of all to everyone who's interested in those ideas. And this is not an easy conversation, because some people want the one-state solution to be a binational one. Others talk about a secular democratic one. People who are closer to the political Islamic movement are a bit worried about the secular adjective in the title. So we have a lot of inside negotiations between us to have a broad church, to have a wide movement where we all can live at least under one program and begin to recruit people, and in the name of these people, to have a dialogue with the official representatives today of the Palestinian people, be there the people in Ramallah or the people who represent the Palestinians in the Israeli Knesset, or people who represent the Palestinians in the various refugee camps or the exilic communities around the world. But we can now talk to them in the name of a popular movement, and we can ask them, do you still adhere to a solution that so far has not changed anything on the ground? On the contrary, provided Israel with an umbrella for unilateral action without any international condemnation to implement the major vision of the consensual Zionist ideology, to have as much of Palestine as possible with as few Palestinians as possible. And the one common theme that comes out from activity on the ground, not just from intellectual brooding and academic conferences, is something that maybe we didn't see beforehand. But now it's very clear because, and that's the third reason for optimism, although it's a very weird one. We can see now clearly, because of the present condition of the Israeli political system, that the two-state solution is not viable anymore, but we can also see the options for change. But by this I mean that the shift, the very strong, dramatic shift of the Israeli political system to the right, namely an Israeli electorate that continues to vote for parties that do not believe in any territorial compromise in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, who do not value very much democracy as a system, and really think that maintaining a racist, supremacist Jewish state is the only formula for the survival, not just of the Jews in Palestine, but also the Jews around the world. This is very entrenched in their DNA, in their mentality. Because of that, it is clearer now that it is, despite the various models of one state, it's very clear that there is a kind of a simple, but not simplistic, idea that can really galvanize us all on the ground and outside. And this is the fact that today in historical Palestine, between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean, you have 12 million people. 6 million have privileges. 6 million have no rights whatsoever, with various degrees of severity. So working for removing the privileges, removing the colonialist institutions of discrimination, of supremacy, is at least a simple and not a simplistic idea of how people should live in the 21st century, without unnecessarily complicating the picture by saying that this should be a solution for the Jewish questions in Europe, or this should be, one should look at the other countries in the Arab world and say, do you see any democracy in the Arab world? So how can you talk about a democracy in Palestine? Let's start with this simple fact that we have an apartheid state in Israel. I call it apartheid in the Mediterranean, the apartheid state of the Mediterranean. I have a friend who is from Israel, and whenever people ask, for us Israeli Jews, it's not always easy to answer. When people say, where are you from? If you say from Israel, you have to then say to the taxi driver, but stop here, I need an hour to explain to you what does it mean that I'm from Israel. I mean, don't immediately think that I'm going to colonize North London. So a friend of mine suggested, because he knows I have this problem, and taxi drivers are not patient, especially now with the heat wave. So he said to me, say to them that you are from the apartheid state in the Mediterranean, and then he will understand. I said, I'm not sure, but we'll try. I haven't tried it yet, so I'll inform you next year whether it worked. But I really think that this is the kind of the reality we want to counter. And the beauty, in a way, of this kind of program that we are pushing forward is that you can also implement it in small steps on the ground and not just as a big program for change from above. Because not all the 6 million Jews are racists. Not all the 6 million Jews who live in Israel are supremacists. Some of them have different experience, especially those in the Galilee, for sharing life with the Palestinians, either in the same place, same habitat, same business, same school, same shopping mall, and so on. And they understand much better this notion, and they know that their Palestinian colleagues don't have the same rights as they do. Some, of course, are totally oblivious, and some are happy to continue with the supremacist apartheid system. But at least the struggle is now far more focused. And there are two other reasons why this struggle can now succeed on the ground where I think it was impossible for it to take off beforehand. The main reason is, and I don't know if you know that, but the Palestinian society is one of the youngest in the world. Almost half of the Palestinians are under 20. And one thing that was a drawback for the Palestinian leadership and movement for many years was that the leadership did not represent the young people. And the young people, or the younger generations of Palestinians, have one big advantage of the previous generation. Because of the Zionist fragmentation of the Palestinian existence, it was impossible for the previous generation to dialogue freely with the different Palestinian groups. You needed physical meetings, encounters, which were in most cases impossible. But now, because of the cyberspace, this generation is far more talking to each other. And we already have some research that shows that when they talk to each other, they talk about a vision of one state, they talk about democracy, they talk about human rights, they talk about civil rights, and it doesn't matter whether they are affiliated to a left group, a Muslim group, a national group. They seem to share a lot about their dreams and aspiration for the future, and they are willing to be politically involved. What we do have, we have the same problem that we had with the Arab Spring in 2011. And this is one of the major issues we're trying to work on the ground. There was a very positive energy, as you know, in the Arab world during the Arab Spring. But the people who were moving the masses through Facebook and through demonstrations had natural and justified suspicions about trade unions, parties, institutions. They didn't like organizations. And without organization, even the best just cause disseminates. And that's what happened in the Arab Spring. The ideas were wonderful. The visions were the right ones. But the disinclination to use organizations, trade unions, parties, because they were, let's face it, in many places known for their corruption, for the lack of efficiency, and so on. But this disinclination is similar, as I said to a group of Egyptian activists when I was in Cairo. I said to them, you are people who want to carry water, very good water, pure water, from one place to the others. But you don't believe in bottles. You actually hate bottles. So you pass the water with your hands, and you are surprised that when you reach your destination, the water has gone. I said to them, maybe not all the bottles are that awful. Maybe you can find some other kinds of containers to do that. And I can see similar disinclination among the young Palestinians to be organized, to be institutionalized. And as an old activist on the left, I know the value of institutions, the value of trade unions, the value of organization. Ideas by themselves do not disseminate freely and do not become a transformative agent on the ground if there is no infrastructure to carry them. Now, this is not easy. We are asking ourselves, should we do it with the rank of file of the existing parties? And by existing parties, I mean the Fatah, the Hamas, the Palestinian parties inside Israel. Should we do it by creating a new party? That's also a very challenging topic. But I think that the fact that for the first time, and that's the reason for my optimism, the first time we are talking about the tools and the methods and not having just another conference about why a one-state solution is better than a two-state solution. We already know that a one-state solution is better than a two-state solution. We already know it's the only vision forward. Now we are actually talking about how to bring it about, given the fact that the international community is against it, given the fact that the Palestinian Authority is against it, given the fact that even the Hamas is against it, given the fact that all the Palestinian parties who are active in Israel are against it. We have to, we at least, we know the problem, but we're not deterred anymore. And maybe the time has also come to tell the Palestinian communities outside, and maybe even the Palestinian Solidarity committees, think how to help us the way we worked so successfully in the case of the boycott and divestment and sanction movement. And I remember how difficult it was to put forward a strategy of boycott, divestment, and sanction against Israel when the Palestinian leadership did not support it at first. And people who were active on behalf of Palestine said, shall we adopt a strategy that the civil society demands, but the leaders are not entirely sure whether they want to support it? And eventually, the civil society here responded well to the civil society there, joined forces in the most successful campaign ever on behalf of Palestine, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And lo and behold, the Fatah recently adopted a resolution supporting BDS. Palestinian members, some Palestinian members of the Israeli Knesset are supporting now the BDS, and I'm sure all of them will support eventually the boycott, divestment, and sanction, because it is working. And maybe they waited to see, and that's okay. It's their prerogative to wait as politicians if they want to. But it's our role as activists to understand, and we all understand it, that the clock of destruction on the ground is working much faster than our ability to bring a change on the other hand. And we need to narrow the gap between the two clocks. We really have to. I think it's time to think of moving beyond the BDS to trade unions here, to solidarity committees here with Palestine, to student organizations, and ask them to continue and repeat the excellent work they did with the Apartheid Week and the support for the BDS, and now support openly the ODS, the One Democratic State. This would be a great boost for our efforts on the ground to create a proper new phase in the liberation of Palestine, which is a Palestinian initiative. Don't get me wrong. It reminds me very much about the model of the ANC, when white activists joined the ANC. It is a young Palestinian initiative that wants to recreate the energy and think a little bit out of the box on the ground itself, because we have done it outside, but on the ground itself, how to relate to the new dismal reality, but in a way, and with this I will finish, in a way, in a funny kind of way, a more helpful reality. I mean, the fact that you have now a clear Israeli hegemonic ideology, which is supremacist, which is racist, when you have an Israeli policy that does not see any difference between the areas Israel occupied in 1967 and areas which are inside Israel, where you have a clear rift in the Jewish world outside Israel between the younger generation that cannot support anymore what Israel and Zionism stands for, where you have a lot of doubts among Christian churches and so on. When you have all these realities and many more, which I haven't, of course, described, and when you have, and with this really the final thought, and when you have a clearer notion among people that the struggle for social justice against neoliberalism is a struggle for justice in Palestine. We had it once in the 50s and the 60s, where we have it now again in a different form. This is why the flag of Palestine is raised in industrial actions and by people fighting for social justice around the world, even if they don't know where Palestine is. But they know what the flag symbolizes. When you have that energy, it means that there is an historical moment of opportunity which we have to seize. And with support from the outside, I think we can build from below a popular movement with the help of existing institutions, and if necessary, building new institutions to push the liberation of Palestine into the 21st century, adapt it to the 21st century, and make it a success, hopefully, in this century, so we don't have to wait for another 100 years. Thank you.
Hi. 2 years ago, I moved to Abergavenny in South Wales, small town, and I moved from West London, where I've been living for many years. So I looked around for things to do in the local area politically, and saw a meeting advertised on the Balfour Declaration, and I thought, well, I might go along, might be a couple of people and a dog there, I don't know. I went there, 40 people there, and I think my experience of what's happened there is that people have taken initiatives and started to build support for the Palestinians. It's a really important issue to take up anyway, but they've built up support for the Palestinian issue, which has meant that we can go on the streets now, and we've got groups of 30 or 40 people. A few weeks ago, for example, we actually went out, one of the people involved actually got pictures of all the people being killed on the first weekend of the Gaza demonstrations, and got pictures of them with names underneath them. And we actually stood in the middle of Abergavenny, which is a small town in South Wales, with these pictures strung together, and we actually And we took names of people who were interested in supporting what we were doing, supporting the Palestinian people. And we got loads of people. And people were coming up and saying, what's this about then? What are you doing? These are the people being killed by the Israeli state this weekend. And I think really that the message really is, if you take initiatives, you're going to get support. The other things we've done recently, it's been amazing really, because 3 weeks ago we had a classical music concert put on with 3 Palestinian musicians in a local building, with 130 people turn up at it. Now, 130 people. First of all, that was a brilliant audience. Secondly, they saw a different side of the Palestinians. They didn't just see people being killed or whatever. They saw a side of skilled, talented musicians. And the third thing is, it meant we could talk to people and we can get them to the next meeting and so on. And then a few weeks ago, I was asked to do a meeting, to actually speak to a meeting about the rights of the Palestinians in Israel. And I've got to say that Ilan's book was the main thing that I based it around. So, sorry, Ilan, it's a brilliant book. But, it's a really good book. So I basically stole most of what he said. And we got recruited 3 people at that meeting. To support for the Palestinians. I just think this is really, really important, and it's an issue we should take up. It's an issue which you can get a lot of support for, and it's an issue which is so important that we actually build the support for the Palestinian people. We should show them they're never forgotten, and that we can actually fight, as Ilan said, fight for a better world and a better solution in the future.
Sabi Segal will be followed by Anne Alexander.
Yes, comrades. We've been used over the years to look on Israel as the main watchdog of Western imperial interests in the Middle East. I think that relationship has become even more crucial to the West since the election of Trump, in particular because of Trump's hostile attitude to Iran. In today's Observer, and this is really, I think, backing up what Ilan was saying, is a report of Israel's demolition of a Palestinian Bedouin village, entrenching Israel's illegal occupation and more or less putting the final nail in the coffin of a Palestinian state. On the positive side, however, again, backing up what Ilan was saying, I think, has been a growing support for the BDS movement internationally. In this country, some statistics not too long ago revealed that 43% of people polled in this country supported the BDS movement against some 13 or 14% who were opposed. Among Labour voters, the proportion is even higher. Even among Tory voters, there was, I think, a small majority of support for the BDS movement. And this has been, fantastically important because the BDS, the strategy, has raised alarm amongst Israeli leaders, who've spoken out about the danger to, Israel's future of the BDS movement. Now, just want to pick on one point. Ilan used the word apartheid, and this is a common word that is used in relation to Israel, comparing Israel with South Africa. It has some value, but it's also misleading in some respects. Israel, the Zionist movement, never exploited the Palestinians in the way that the South Africans super-exploited the black working class. Israel was only bent on ethnically cleansing the Palestinians, as we see in this latest example, the report which is in today's Observer. And that is why the international solidarity movement is so absolutely vital. The Palestinians depend on the solidarity movement, and if not for that, I think Israel might have completed the ethnic cleansing that Ilan documented so brilliantly in his work. Just one final point. The Arab Spring, when Mubarak fell, I rang a Palestinian friend of mine in Jaffa, and I said, what do you think about this? And he said, the gates of my freedom have been opened. And clearly, that is an absolutely vital step, which we look forward to at some point in the future for the ultimate support for the Palestinians must come from the Arab working class throughout the Middle East. Thank you.
Anne Alexander will be followed by Liam from Plymouth Socialist Workers' Party.
So following on from where the last comrade left off, I want to talk about something that Ilan sketched out, I think, very well in his opening contribution about how the movement on the ground that's being built from below in Palestine can interrelate with the building and rebuilding of movements from below in the rest of the Arab world, and how these two processes need to go side by side, both at the level of the big political questions, making the issue of fighting for one democratic state something that is part and parcel of being an activist in the movement for social justice in Egypt or elsewhere in the Arab world. Why is that so important? Because actually, if we look at the history of where the revolution in Egypt comes from, its back history starts actually in around 2000 with the Al-Aqsa Intifada, and the wave of protests and strikes and student walkouts and school students going into the streets that hit particularly Egypt but other places around the Arab world after that. Throughout the whole of the 2000s and the decade before 2011, there was an interweaving of the processes of organising solidarity with the Palestinians on the ground in defiance of the Mubarak regime in Egypt, and the building of organisation and from below in Palestine. I don't think it's actually an accident that the same decade sees that process in the Arab world, but also the rise of the BDS movement. But I very much echo Ilan's point that I think we need to go beyond that. And for the reason that he said, we have to have real clarity about the architecture of imperialism in the Middle East. Trump, yes, very helpfully, actually makes that extremely clear. That when he literally is embracing, for example, the Saudi Prince Mohammed bin Salman and the Saudi ruling class, and that they in turn are the role they play in propping up Israel, we can see that extremely clearly. But it also comes on to another question of a different kind of organisation, because one of the things that 2011 and 2012 in Egypt showed is that unless there is also a movement in Egypt that is capable of breaking the Egyptian state, so that it abandons the Camp David agreement, then there will be no liberation, not just for Gaza, but for the rest of Palestine. And that requires actually a different kind of organisation. It requires a clarity about the role of the state. I would argue it requires revolutionary socialist organisation that understands that imperialism is not something only takes place, a gyration at the top level of the world system, but is driven down through the ruling classes of the region.
Please stop there.
I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Liam will be followed by Mo Adam Ali. And just before you come in, Liam, I have a question that someone has asked me to read out. It's from Sarah Hicks. The question is, some parties have said that they, or we, should work with Israeli workers to solve what's happening in Palestine. Personally, I don't agree. What do you think?
Well, I suppose it's sort of the last contributor but one kind of answered it, because I was going to ask, what is the social weight of the Palestinian workers? Because if we're talking about apartheid, the sanctions and boycott sort of campaign against apartheid South Africa obviously had some economic effect on its own, but as far as I can tell, its primary sort of effect was to show the people at the top of apartheid that they were hated internationally, and to show the ANC and the activists against it that they had international support. But it was primarily the black workers who were integral to the South African economy, and this is why they had the weight and why they were able to overthrow that system. So if the Palestinians are excluded completely from the economic life of the country, I suppose my question is, partly from that question as well, what is the hope then? Because obviously, the organised Israeli workers, the trade unions, as I understand it, are wholly wedded to Zionism. So is there some way to break from that? I know in the Socialist Workers' Party we say there is only one solution, revolution, and in the general sense that's absolutely true. But is the point of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign therefore just to keep the Palestinians on life support until that revolution comes, or is there some other answer within that? Sorry, Comrades, I don't have any answers, I only have questions, but I hope people can address those. Thank you.
Mo Adam Ali will be followed by Sybil Cock.
Hello everyone. Ilan, I'm your biggest fan. I've just bought your book, so I hope you'll sign that for me later. Just a couple of points really. Just a couple of points. So I guess for me, I'd really like to know what you think about whether or not there needs to be a shift in leadership for both the Israeli and the Palestinian side if we are looking at a viable peace solution. You know, I look at the period of Rabin, and yes, there was bloodshed, but actually we did have progress. Is the leadership too right on Israeli side, and what's your thoughts about that? And then the other thing I'd like some advice on, for everyone really, is sometimes people get nervous speaking about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict because they feel they'll be demonized or called anti-Semitic. Now, I'm a Muslim. Islam was born in Saudi. I'm always critiquing Saudi policy. Don't make me anti-Muslim. So similarly, I should be, as anybody should be able to critique Israeli policy. Loads of Jewish people also critique Israeli policy. So when people try to shut you down and say, oh, that's anti-Semitic, how would you advise people to approach that? Because it's not always the case. So I'd really like to know your views on that. Thank you.
Sybil will be followed by Naomi Wimborne Idrissi. And just before you start, Sybil, I've got another question that someone's asked to be read out from Shads. He says, is there scope for political parties of both Arabic and Hebrew speakers? There must be non-religious secularists on both sides yearning for non-religious, non-nationalist politics.
My name's Sybil Cock. I'm from Tower Hamlets Palestine Solidarity Campaign. I'm also a member of the executive of the PSC. What I want to say is, in relation particular to the first speaker, the guy from Wales, about how easy it is to get people involved and to tell stories and to get people engaged in politics around the issue of Palestine. What I'd like to say is this. Visiting Palestine is actually key to that. Now, the Israeli government, I think about a year ago, announced that anybody who had a public position of support for boycott, divestment and sanctions would not be allowed into Israel. And they have managed to bar a few, actually rather few people, very high-profile people, from visiting. Well, you have to visit Palestine, you have to go to Israel. You have to go to Tel Aviv airport, more or less. But what I'm saying is that actually it is in fact quite easy to go and visit Palestine, and hundreds of people do that every year. It's cheap, EasyJet flies there, good flights. There are dozens of organisations which take you on tours which are highly political. Now, everything in Palestine is political, but what happens is you get to meet the popular resistance committees, which Ilan talked about, which are everywhere, in all the towns, in the countryside. You get to meet people who are beginning to start up this process. It's really only the last few years. And the important thing about it is that when you come home, you can talk in a much more knowledgeable fashion about what the issues actually are. When you go to Palestine, people will say, yes, it's wonderful, it's so great that you're here. They love having internationals there because they don't want our charity, they don't want any of that. What they want is for people to see it with their own eyes and come home and talk about it. Tell the stories, paint the pictures, make the movies, whatever it is, write the political writing. So that's why there are lots of organisations with which you can do that. I'm in the process of planning a tour myself for later this year or early next year. And I'm just saying it is actually a life-changing experience, because we all know what we think, and we've seen the pictures and we've seen the shooting and everything, but to actually be there on one of the Friday demonstrations and talk to the people about how they're organising is a very, very special privilege, which is within the reach of a lot of us. Thank you.
Naomi will be followed by Zaina.
Hello there. I'm from Jewish Voice for Labour. Here's my badge. And I was very interested in what Ilan said about how we either build institutions to take forward Palestine solidarity action, or we have to use those that are in existence. Now, obviously, the Labour Party is probably the biggest organisation in this country which has a constituency which calls itself socialist and which should be active in fighting anti-colonial struggles and taking up issues of racism and so on. As you all know, no doubt, the Labour Party also has the most massive split within its membership on the issues of anti-Semitism and Israel-Palestine. And what Jewish Voice for Labour has been trying to do is to give the people within the party who do understand where Palestine sits in the global picture of anti-colonial struggle and so on, is to give them the confidence to take up the question without the fear of being branded an anti-Semite. The effect of the charges of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party have been quite devastating in terms of chilling debates, making people frightened even to mention the word Palestine or to take up any such issues. So I'd be interested when Ilan comes back to see if he has a view on what's going on in the Labour Party. It has been a struggle because there's this right-wing machinery which has hated Jeremy Corbyn and people who've come into the party to support him from the get-go, and who simply do not want a genuine socialist leader who may get a chance to enter Downing Street at some point. We have had some influence. It's behind the scenes, but recently the National Executive Committee produced some new guidelines on anti-Semitism. And to our delight, I mean, it's not perfect, but they really have tried very carefully in quite a nuanced way to distinguish anti-Semitism, genuine hatred, prejudice, and so on towards Jewish people from criticism of Israel and Zionism. And I think we want to welcome that. So those of you who are not in the party, you still have the opportunity to give encouragement, maybe through your trade unions, in your student unions and so on, to those forces which are at work trying to promote active pro-Palestinian solidarity in Labour and to roll back on the fear of false allegations of anti-Semitism, while, of course, fighting real anti-Semitism. We mustn't forget that. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Okay, Zaina will be followed by Ronnie Casserills. Also, I'm going to ask speakers now, please, to limit their contributions to 2 minutes. I'll now tap on the mic when you have half a minute left, just so we can try and fit everybody in. Thanks.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I found it really interesting when he commented about the new Palestinian generation or the Arab youth living in a time of cyberspace, because we're currently in like a technological age where there is no boundaries. You can talk about anything, you can find anything out. However, there's a really big problem, whereas Israel is the #1 country in cyber hacking, and their hacking industry was actually kind of founded from the military, and there's a lot of issues and stories that I've heard when I went back to Ramallah this summer about people having their computers hacked and them finding out that a guy's gay through his history, and then they'd use that information to make him work with the army, and if he doesn't work with the army, they'll bring that information out, and unfortunately in a conservative community and society, that information would either lead him to be expelled from his family or to be killed, and hence he ends up in this situation where he has to cooperate with the Israelis. And another story happens with a lot of girls, where there's a girl that would have intercourse with a guy that would be filmed, and that would be sent to her father in an attempt to get her to cooperate with the army as well. So I was wondering, as a young generation, because it is really risky to kind of put your activism and your ideas out there on the internet when you have a government that sees you as an enemy and has access to all your information at any time to access that and to harm you, because they look at you as an enemy, and they have the right to do that because they are, at the end of the day, the most powerful government in the region. So I was just wondering what other ideas or suggestions the youth can partake in order to show more awareness and to overcome this occupation. Thank you.
Ronnie will be followed by Joshua Agbo.
Thanks. I'm going to be very quick. Ilan, yes, it's going to take a long time. The South African struggle took a long time. Sometimes things happen quicker than we expect. We all know that. But I recall on the South African struggle, there were times when we really felt we weren't getting there. And it seemed as though the apartheid state, with the support of Britain and America and the like, was going to be there for decades and decades and decades. And so did a lot of people here. You'll recall that. But things can quicken up. And the aspect of boycott, divestment, sanctions isn't just to send a signal to the oppressed, struggling people that we stand with you. It does weaken the resolve of the dominating ruling group, of the oppressor, and ultimately its economy. And it works in such a way, and we had this with South Africa, there were times of real low water marks in South Africa. International solidarity at such times was at a higher level than internal struggle, our armed struggle, the political struggle, and it inspired the internal struggle. Just as when the internal resistance goes higher, so it inspires the international community and puts the pressure on those reactionary states that want to stand by oppression. But I want to say this one thing that hasn't been raised, and it bodes so well for the people of Palestine, and that is their resolve to resist. And it was when the young people of South Africa showed their contempt for death that you saw the end coming for the South African apartheid system.
Please sum up.
And it's the end now. When, and this is going to be the end for the Israeli Zionist entity, when a young 15-year-old girl stands up to an Israeli military officer and clouts him in the mug and is prepared to go to prison, is prepared to be killed on the spot like her brothers or go to prison disgracefully for 8 years, when people of Gaza will attack that bleeding fence day after day, knowing they're going to be mown down, that spells the end of that Zionist entity. And I'd say, Ilan, with what you people are organizing and with the idea of one democratic state, won't we see someday not only the Palestinian people from the neighboring countries storming those fences and the Palestinians?
Thank you very much. I must ask you to stop there. I'm so sorry.
But people like us as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I like the closing of Ilan, that we do not need to wait for another 100 years to free, Palestine from the Israeli control. What worries me about the narrative of a Palestinian struggle, either independence or whatever it is that how long should it take the United States of America or even the United Nations to grant the people of Palestine their independence? We've witnessed a long, struggle for this independence. Their nationalist heroes, people like late Edward Said and the rest of them, gave their lives to this struggle. And to this day, we are still talking about, the lives of people who have, been murdered, brutally murdered by the state of Israel, and nothing has been done by the man he has brilliantly described, to be honest, to some extent, Donald Trump. It did not take Donald Trump any long time to move, the capital, the headquarters of, to declare Jerusalem the capital of Israel. Then the question is, how long should it take the same United States of America to declare the independence of Palestine? Thank you.
Hiya. Actually, Veronica's rules could have had my 2 minutes, to be honest. Can I just say, it's been quite frustrating being a member of the National Union of Journalists, quite a small union. We've been to conference after conference trying to get somewhere with boycott BDS, and we've got nowhere, basically. At various times, the unions supported some initiatives about attacking what Israel's done to people, and we're still trying to find a way through it, really. But this year we had a motion. There was a motion that went to the conference talking about the Giro d'Italia, the cycle race, because it was stage in Israel. And all the motion was arguing was that if people felt they didn't want to do that the union would support them in taking a stand to say, I don't really want to do that. That was it. It wasn't anything more than that. And that was just too much, because basically what we come up against is the issue about the BBC and its impartiality and its need to keep it. Now, that would be lovely, wouldn't it, if that was the case? If the BBC was impartial. Oh, my God, my comrade Phil Turner got on dared to question the sacred cow and got shouted at and roundly heckled by people and denounced and God knows what. You cannot say that the BBC is not impartial. Well, just watch it and see how it reports any issue, including what happens in Israel, despite the fact that we had a Palestinian journalist shot in the stomach as part of the Land Day demonstrations. But we're already behind on BDS, but I do think that in all our unions we have to talk about what Ilan Pappé was saying was saying, which is that as trade unionists we have to go forward, have groups to give people actually confidence to continue to do something to fight for this in all our trade unions, because it's a very important thing for trade unions to take these stands. And in situations like in South Africa, it was very, very good, so we need to keep doing it. And so I think we need to think about that as trade unionists when we go back to our local branches. And thanks for the time.
Thank you for your comments and questions. I'll have to be brief, so I'll try to kind of put them together into one bit. I think what is really kind of a common theme for many of the issues that were raised is first of all, is history. If you want to tackle people who accuse you of anti-Semitism, you should be informed well enough about the origins of Zionism and the relationship between Zionism and Judaism. And if you know your facts, if you know what is the difference between the two, nobody will ever be able to undermine your confidence that when you are declaring that Zionism is racism, you are right morally, ideologically, and politically. So I think one of the most important things is to tell people to study a little bit the history and see the distinction between a racist ideology, which is Zionism, and a religion. And Jeremy Corbyn himself said it, and I know he got stick for it, but it was the right thing to say. Supporting the Islamic State is not supporting Islam necessarily. And I think these kinds of comparisons are important. We shouldn't be afraid of making them because we want to change the discourse in this country. And rather being on the defense all the time for taking a valid moral position against a racist ideology, we should attack the people who attack us by saying, why are you not joining us in our fight against racism, wherever it is, including in Palestine? The second point, again about history, is about the working class, a few people mentioned in Palestine. Now, as someone commented correctly, there are many similarities between apartheid South Africa and the situation in Palestine, but there are many dissimilarities. That's what happened when you do comparison. Most of the Palestinians are unemployed, so this talking about Palestinian workers as people who are in a working place that could be organized in any way has very little to do with the reality on the ground. And most of the Palestinians who are employed in the West Bank, unfortunately employed directly or indirectly in deepening the colonization because there's no other option for any other kind of labor. And the same is true about Palestinian laborers inside Israel. I think the key thing, and I haven't talked about it because there's no time to do this, is to go back to the early history of joint industrial action by Palestinians and Jews in the mandatory period in the 1950s when the Arab Jews were coming from all around the Arab world and at first saw themselves as part of the Arab community until the Zionist state worked very hard to separate the two communities. One of the major things we're trying to do now on the ground is not to give up on the Arab Jewish community, on the 50% of Jews who came from Arab countries and Muslim countries that we in the left in Israel have given up on them. We've decided they are racist, they are anti-Arab, and many of them are. Many of them are. And they vote for right-wing parties, and many of them do. But that doesn't mean that we have to give up, because they are the ones who would be part of the one state, not European Jews who have passports of other European countries who may stay or leave. These are the people with which we should work, and we're trying to find new ways into their hearts and minds, and I think this is part of it. The last 2 points. One is, I was talking about, maybe it's not the right term for a Marxist meeting, a broad church, but I do believe in broad churches, and I do make a distinction between creating a strong socialist party on the ground, and unfortunately the Israeli Communist Party regards religiously the two-state solution, talking about religion, and it's very hard to work with them on a one-state solution. They are the biggest opponents of the ODS movement, unfortunately. But it doesn't mean that we don't have to strengthen the socialist and Marxist movements on the ground. But we are talking about the campaign that is wider than that, where not everybody agrees about everything, but there is enough common ground to create an umbrella organization for a one-state solution, where each one of us will try to have an impact of his own ideological position. Finally, on the Labour Party, because I was asked about it. I think that there is, and this is true about Mo's question about leadership. Sometimes, you don't look for new leaders. You look for a better and more effective role of the civil society in the affairs of societies. When politicians are not fulfilling their role, when you question their moral backbone, sometimes you try and do the things yourself, and you're not looking for yet another good leaders. If you have the good leaders, you support them. And why do I say this? Because one of the biggest fabrication that unfortunately too many people in the Labour Party has accepted as a reality is that the Jewish organization in this country represent the Jews of England. This is not true. The Board of Deputies does not represent everyone who sees himself as a Jew, a half a Jew, or a quarter of Jew. These organizations are in the hands of Israel. They are part of the Zionist lobby. And the fact that the Labour Party was willing to go into this twisted road of self-investigation and inquiry commissions, because not Jews in this country, but bodies that claim to represent Jews who are strongly connected to Israel, accused them of anti-Semitism, the problem is with the Labour Party and not with these people. They're doing what they are paid to do and what they will do. I think it's time to change the discourse of this country and not to play into the hands of a very frightened, intimidated, pro-Israeli lobby that because of the BDS and because of the doubts among young Jews in this country is using all its ammunition to try and stop the snowball of the delegitimization of the pariah racist state of Israel. We should not help them to stop the snowball. We should move it ahead so that we can really help and change the reality on the ground. Thank you.